Hello everybody, I'm Karen Whittaker and I'm a reader in Child and Family Health at the School of Nursing at the University of Central Lancashire. My background's in health visiting and today I'm going to talk to you about seizing opportunities and the role of the health visitor, reflecting a little bit on my own career. This is a short overview of what I'm going to cover. So we'll look at the early role of the health visitor by drawing on some history and research examples and consider why a focus on children is particularly important for this role. In doing so, I hope to tell you a little bit about myself, where I've got to, and use this as a chance to encourage others to seize opportunities, because this really matters for the health of children, families and communities, but actually also nurses who aspire to becoming health visitors themselves. If we look back, health visiting is actually quite an aged profession. It started back in the 19th century and is over 150 years old now. Its origins began back in Manchester and Salford in the northwest of England, which is where I'm placed at the moment. So back in 1862, the Manchester and Salford Sanitary Association employed home visitors to specifically improve the health, hygiene and mother and baby care. And here there was a particular focus on understanding the need to protect children if we're going to improve health. So the approach was very targeted at that time. As the time moved on, these roles became increasingly popular and it became apparent that they were necessary for genuinely improving public health. And we saw then the development of the Local Government Act, which introduced policy which actually required home visits to be made by these people called health visitors to all new mothers, and this had to occur within the month of the birth of the baby. Sometime later, the employment of health visitors was transferred from local authorities through to the National Health Service. And this is the pattern that we now recognise for nurses as health visitors being employed in the NHS. Although it's true to say that today there's a feeling that actually we're returning back to local authority roots because, of course, commissioning of modern day services comes from local authorities. So the most recent developments came about at the beginning of the coalition government, when in 2011 there was the implementation plan, which was focusing specifically on the development of the health visiting workforce in response to the problem of a drastic reduction in numbers. So the expansion of the workforce, as well as a reshaping of what health visiting and school nursing to some extent was doing, was seen to be a really necessary act in order to take the profession forward and meet the needs of children and families. And by the time we got to 2012, we then reached the 150 years anniversary. And during this period of the implementation plan, what was being encouraged was this need for knowledgeable, skilled practitioners who had a very clear work focus on families and communities. Now, a particular feature of that role was working with children. And as we move to the next slide, we can see again that started historically by an understanding that by investing in children's lives, there was the opportunity to invest in society. Now, of course, previously, when we were part of industrial Britain, children had a very important role to play because they were workers, as well as in their childhood years, as well as later in their adult years. So we could be quite cynical and see that this was actually more to do with looking at the efficiency of the country, the economic efficiency, as opposed to a genuine concern for the health and well-being of children. Nevertheless, there was a recognition that standards in working situations were inappropriate, cruel, and really bad for children's health. So the need to invest or taking action to improve children's health was recognised as something that would be good for the common good and would support national efficiency. And health visitors were identified as people who could be mothers' friends. This is a phrase that has been described by Davies in some writing back in the 80s. And this is an interesting notion because as the years have gone by, health visitors, of course, have typically worked with mothers, but in actual fact their focus should be on the whole family. And indeed, they are friendly with mothers, but of course, as professionals, this needs to be a professional friendship if it's going to stand the chance of offering objective support and care for the whole family. So as we move forward, I'm now going to tell you a little bit about myself. So I started my nursing and health visiting career also back in Manchester in the northwest of England. Of course, the birthplace is health visiting, as I've already mentioned. And indeed, I had my health visiting placements in the city of Salford. And there's just some images here where you can see the nature of this typical inner city housing that ranged from tower blocks to terraced streets. So this practice during the mid-80s through to the 90s was happening at a time when there were numerous child case inquiries and situations where there was still a huge need for somebody to be advocating on the part of children and families. And as we move forward into the next phase of the 90s, we could see that politics were evolving as well. We'd had a long-standing period of a Conservative government and many changes in the way that society was developing. But by 1997, a new era started with a new phase of politics and the new Labour government coming into office. This was a chance of fresh opportunity for health visiting, but more importantly for children and families. And we can see here just a sample of some of the documents that were published during that time, and as a result, the birth of a programme called Sure Start. What Sure Start offered was an intention to purposefully support those in more disadvantaged communities to improve or to challenge rather the inequalities that existed within communities. What was promised was a fresh focus on children, and also as part of that an expanded role for health visitors, and an encouragement of helping health visitors go back to their origins and work beyond health and look at the more social dimensions of families' lives, which meant that there would be a shift from dealing with problems towards preventing problems. And of course, in the background to all of this was the Aitchison Public Health Inquiry, which was demonstrating that actually children were no better off, and that the huge poverty divide between the health divide between children that were poorer and those that were in better off families was enormous. So action was certainly needed. So this produced an opportunity for health visitors to move into fresh roles. For myself at this time, I had the opportunity to take up a lecturing position in health visiting practice, which enabled me to move my career from primarily focusing just on the delivery of health visiting services, but to combining that with both the education of new workforce coming through, but also getting involved in some research, which of course is a critical part of informing practice. So this was fortuitous for myself because this was happening at a time when we had a new interest in children and families, the growth of Sure Start programs, as well as some small localized positive parenting programs happening in a range of regions. So, of course, the reason that there was this particular interest in parenting was that there was a strong argument that parenting actually was strongly implicated in public health. Some of the theories that were existing at that time and gathering strength was an argument over the need to support parenting self-efficacy. In other words, the need to support practices in parents where parents could believe in their own abilities so that they could draw more effectively on the resources around them. And those resources included the resources within themselves as humans, their own ability to think and act confidently, to use their ingenuity, but also the resources that existed within communities, which would include educational resources, community services, and also relationship resources in friendships and support other relationships. So the programs that were emerging around that time as well was the Nurse Family Partnership Program, which of course is an individual program, although focused particularly at teenage parents, and also group-based parenting programs. But we mustn't forget as well what health visiting had always been doing and was continuing to do was home visiting, and that was a feature of their practice which was quite unique. The evidence base supporting the need for the development in parenting and parenting support was coming through loud and clear from a range of Cochrane reviews, and Jane Barlow is a leading author in many of those pieces of research. Now, one of the challenges in working with the field of parenting is illustrated on the next slide. This is an example actually of a building in London where all the workings of the building are actually featured architecturally on the outside, exposing the complexity of the inner workings of the building for it to operate and function. I've illustrated this here because this is exactly what parenting programs are like. As social programs, they're inherently complex. They don't just involve one stream of work, they involve numerous streams that cross over and that need to connect in order that they can combine together to form one whole service. The challenge, of course, in working in this complex environment for the practitioner, so for example the health visitor, is that they're very difficult to untangle and understand exactly where to put your resource, where to put your effort, and how to hone interventions. So to learn and generate evidence from practice needed particular styles of research. So I mentioned that moving to a lecturer's position provided a fresh opportunity for myself, and also an opportunity to work with health visiting, but in a slightly different way. And this is where I had the chance to work as a researcher. But making that decision was about being bold and taking a leap of faith to some extent. Because moving into the field of research and advancing knowledge often means starting a research degree such as a PhD. So there was the chance to ask questions but also take the challenge, which meant seeking out funding to complete some research, to consider where I would do it, and that in my instance that meant distance learning, which very much felt like going into the unknown. But nevertheless, if we don't make that jump and we don't challenge ourselves, then we will never move forward, and that was certainly true in my case. So I did take the leap and had the opportunity to complete a study examining parenting support. On the next slide, we have a short description of the study. Now, the question that was being addressed was this very straightforward, seemingly straightforward question, which was how do services work? But what we particularly needed to know was for whom and in what circumstances do services work? Because as many practitioners will say, they recognise that they can do the same thing and get different responses when working with different families. So the interest that I had was particularly looking at an example positive parenting program. Within the program, there was it was run as if it was a group session run over a number of weeks, and it invited mothers and fathers, and indeed any other people who were taking on parenting roles and caring for children. So what we needed to know was, how did this program work? Who did it work most well for? And were there particular circumstances that enabled people to get the most benefit out of the program? So the approach that I took, the research approach, is called realistic evaluation. This is a form of evaluation that's been written and described by authors Pawson and Tilley in their seminal book in 1997, and has since developed into quite a promising research approach and has many, many users today. The essence of realist evaluation, as it is now known, is to look and examine the context, mechanisms and outcomes of a program, and to conduct your research in such a way that you're ensuring that there is a theory that is helping drive the planned investigation. Within the realist approach as well, there's an acceptance that social programs are inherently complex, and as part of that complexity they have many layers, and therefore the researcher's task is to examine what those layers are, and as I say, understand what the contexts are, the circumstances within which different mechanisms will become active to produce outcomes. So the way in which I collected data for this study started off with a survey to establish what the everyday experiences were for parents that were using the positive parenting program. And then I followed through in detail a number of selected cases to see what their experiences were and try and unpick what mechanisms were coming into play that led to whatever outcome for themselves. Now, without going into too much detail about the next steps within the study, I'm going to move quite quickly actually to the chief findings. And these were essentially that the parenting service couldn't actually be described as one thing. It was an amalgam of a variety of things. And parents did not recognise the positive parenting program as the main program. They understood it as a course, a form of parenting support that operated alongside many other varieties of formal parenting support. And within this illustration, we've got the yellow circle at the centre showing some examples of those formal systems. So they included mother and child groups, parent and child groups, the actual positive parenting course, home visiting that they received mostly from health visitors, but also Sure Start Children's Centre workers. But they also include a range of other community events and activities that were happening in community libraries or schools or churches, as well as other courses for parents, but not necessarily focused on parenting. So together, these different elements made up a comprehensive parenting service. And you'll notice that the circle around those elements is a broken line. And that's been purposefully broken to illustrate that it was important that parents were able to move across the boundaries in order to move in and out of different components of the service. But in order to get to any of them, they had to first of all find out about them. And of course, this is where the personal and informal worlds of people's lives came up against and merged really with the more formal systems where the parenting services sat. So it was in their informal social systems that families typically found out by word of mouth quite often, and also were able to get and arrived at any parenting support group. However, just getting there wasn't necessarily enough, because it could be that if they didn't have a good experience on arriving at the parent and child group, for instance, then they weren't likely to stay. So being there was also a critical experience, and staying there would only be achieved if they had a particular experience that was positive and welcoming when attending the group. And of course, after attending the group, it wouldn't necessarily end there. They might, from the group, be introduced to, for example, the parenting course or a positive parenting course, or indeed find out that they could have some extra home visiting if they shared in confidence with somebody at the group that they were facing particular difficulties. So in other words, the parents moved between all these different forms of support. And critical in this were relationships that they developed both with informal carers and formal supporters, such as health visitors. So on the next slide, I've provided a summary list, really, of the key findings from that study. And they are that actually we shouldn't see services as single entities. We should understand them as being parts of a whole that need to work together in a complementary fashion, because people, when using community services, will move from a range of different forms of support. And importantly, interpersonal relationships were key features of those parents' journeys. And it was the informal networks that were particularly distinct sources of influence when it came to helping people move through that journey. Nevertheless, practitioners had a key role in shaping the environment to make sure that people got to know about and hear about different sources of support. And they had the opportunity, through use of interpersonal skills, to boost experiences of parenting self-efficacy and helping parents draw on both their inner resources and those wider community resources. So in completing this study, of course, a PhD study takes considerable time, especially when working at the same time and studying part-time, which is typically how many nurses and health visitors would complete a PhD. So simultaneous to the study were a number of other public health developments and growth of knowledge, and in particular a growth in public health evidence as seen on the next slide. So you'll see here listed a range of things that knowledge was growing in, and this was particularly life course research that was telling us and explaining about the importance of early child development and the impact of health inequalities negatively impacting on the development of children, but also the connection between mental health and public health, and that indeed if we were to address the public health of a population, then serious attention needed to be given to people's mental well-being as well. Simultaneous to that was growing evidence about the impact of violence in the family and violence between couples. Not only does that have a damaging effect on the people directly involved, but also creates a hostile environment within which children are growing up, negatively impacting again on their mental well-being and sense of safety. And Michael Marmot in 2010 published yet another report on health inequalities, moving on from the Aitchison report and the Black report before that, illustrating sadly that we were still in a state where social inequalities were negatively impacting on people's health. And this didn't just matter to individuals, but this was having a devastating impact on the state of society. Now on the next slide, we see as time moves on, yet again, politics was evolving. During this period of time, we'd had a long period of Labour government, and by the time we got to 2010, there was a change yet again, and this time a coalition government. And one of the promises of that coalition government was to take action on improving the state of service that health visitors were able to offer. And this meant a promise of investing in the number of health visitors and expanding the workforce up to 4,200, but also to transform the service the health visitors were very much a part of. And as a result, you'll see here this document, A Call to Action, published in February 2011 by the Department of Health, which set out a plan for this very ambition. Now on the next slide, we'll see that this yet again brought fresh opportunity, not just for myself, but huge numbers of people across the profession. But we would like to think as well it brought opportunity for children and families, but perhaps time will only tell whether that really was the result. So alongside this implementation plan, which was, as I've mentioned, about the growth of the workforce and transforming the nature of the work to address health inequalities, to improve children's chances in life, there needed to be some development of the evidence base as well to really offer some checks on how that implementation plan was functioning and the possible chances it could have. So the National Nursing Research Unit, based at King's College in London, was commissioned to deliver a policy research programme on health visiting to support this call for action. And as part of that, 3 research studies were commissioned. And in the picture here, you can see the research team, of which I was fortunate enough to join. And this is us here in 2012 at the CPHVA conference, reporting some early findings. Now, this research team was expertly led by Dame Professor Sarah Cowley and also Professor Jill Mayburn. And this gave the programme huge prominence with such outstanding expertise both in health visiting and also workforce research, which is what Jill Mayburn brought to the team. Now, as this programme developed, as I mentioned before, it involved 3 different studies. And these are outlined on the next slide, showing the aims in particular of one of the studies that I was involved in. So the first study concerned a literature review and a narrative synthesis of health visiting practice. And this was important because we needed to truly establish what evidence was there for health visitors to practice. What areas of work should they be investing their time in if they are going to make the best impact? But because the service was being transformed, and because we knew we were at a state of quite desperation really with respect to the size of the workforce and the changes that had been happening to it just as the implementation plan was starting, that is, greatly reduced numbers and huge numbers due to retire. There was also a need to have a look at, so if we're going to recruit people to the service, what motivates people to join, and what do we need to do in order to help them stay after making that investment in expanding the workforce. But also it was necessary to know what service users' views were about the service and what were they gaining from the expansion of this workforce and transformed service. But as I mentioned before, I was involved in particularly with the Start and Stay study, which was the study concerned with recruitment and retention. So I'm going to mention a little bit more about that one. Now, chief questions that we had within that Start and Stay study were, first of all, what was it that people wanted from their job? What were their aspirations? And what helped them gain satisfaction in their job if we were to assume that job satisfaction was going to be positively correlated with helping people stay. So ultimately, what attracted people and what keeps people? Now, On the next slide, we have I'm going to move very quickly to the findings of that study, and they are summed up here by answering this overall question of what was it that health visitors valued about their practice. And right at the core of this is this opportunity to make a difference for children and families. But what was also clear was that this was being challenged by workforce conditions and in terms of the nature of the job, but also in how the job was being managed and organised. Some of the challenges that health visitors spoke about when explaining about their practice purpose, but also the joys that they reflected on in terms of what kept them going, are summed up in the 4 blue squares here. So first of all, they talked about the satisfaction in being able to apply and use the knowledge and skills and experience that they had acquired, not just from their years in practicing as a health visitor, but also in their years in practicing as a nurse, and how they brought that to bear and apply within the context of health visiting practice. But in order to bring that to bear and to use it properly, they argued the point that they needed to have sufficient professional autonomy, because without that, they were unable to respond appropriately and flexibly to the needs of families, and therefore make full use of their knowledge and help families to the full of their abilities. And in helping families, they noted that their work was very much about connecting families, sometimes with one another, but particularly with other services within the community. And that meant that a chief part of their role meant that they had to be skilled in working in collaboration with other partners within the community. So changes in their world of practice mattered not just in how their own service was organised, but also in how other services were organised. Because for health visitors to function effectively, they need to be able to work alongside others and offer a holistic service and care and support to families. So it was very clear that the good health visitor, the health visitor that was attracted to the role, the health visitor who believed they could fulfill their potential and go the full journey in helping families to make a difference, needed a range of skills and knowledge, but also needed to work in an organisational structure that would allow them and support them in applying those knowledge and skills. So this was quite an interesting finding because it reflected closely also what the families were telling us, what they wanted from what the health visitor had to offer them. And on the next slide, I've combined the summary of the 3 separate studies, and we can see how together they actually were working, showed evidence of this central goal of this desire to make a difference to children and families. I'll start first then with the literature review. The literature review examined a whole body of evidence, UK evidence, on anything that described and explained and illustrated what health visitors did in practice. And what was clear here was that practice was a highly purposeful endeavour that was guided by a particular orientation. And through that orientation, which was to promote good health, generate good health, to offer non-judgmental service, and to work in the situation that the person was in. Through that orientation, they delivered a core service that was influenced by relationships with people. It was very much driven through home visiting, and it focused clearly on assessing the needs of individuals and families. And it was through that practice that it was possible to make a difference for children and families. Now, I've already explained that the health visitors themselves were clear that in order to function effectively, they needed to be able to develop relationships with families. And they particularly spoke about those relationships needing to be reciprocal and therefore respectful. And as part of that, they needed to have key skills in listening and being able to match and attune their practice to the needs of individual families. And when in the second study, the service user study, we spoke to parents, it was also clear that what parents wanted and valued in the health visiting service that they were receiving was respectful lines of communication and a service that was sufficiently flexible to offer support based on the client's needs. So this needed they were particularly supportive of an autonomous practitioner who could make decisions that were responsive to their needs and that could focus on the time and place that was necessary to deliver the best service. So, as I said before, alongside any period of research, there is also other growing evidence that is happening in the same time period. So during this time period of delivering this program of health visitor research, there had been a particular growth of developmental science, which I've listed on the next slide. Now, developmental science is providing evidence which connects both the knowledge of the biological development of the brain alongside the behavioural practices of human behaviour and exposures in the environment and what can impact on both those biological changes and behavioural changes. There's seminal work by Shonkoff and Phillips published in 2000 which explained very clearly how the infant's brain architecture is influenced by the different caregiver relationships that the infant is exposed to. As time has gone on, that knowledge base has grown, and it's very clear also that negative relationships, exposure to violence, as I mentioned briefly before, can have a damaging effect on the nature of the bond between the parent and the child, but also on the development of that child's brain. Other pieces of evidence have been published in a series by the Lancet, and Shonkoff has continued with his body of work, and which leads to explaining this notion of toxic stress, where stress hormones are produced to such an extent that there is a biologically changed impact on the way in which the brain grows to the detriment of the child. This strong evidence, which is to some extent quite alarming, has been really influential in not only calling for changes in policies that we see here in the UK, but actually across the globe. And large organisations such as UNICEF are calling, and the WHO are calling for a range of policies that support the investment in early childhood, and in particular early childhood development interventions, and offered on a universal basis. So moving with the times and thinking about those policy changes, we can also look at some of the work of the WHO. In 2013, they held a meeting on human capital. So in other words, they were looking at what are the investments in human life to create strong, healthy societies. This is a summary report illustrated here. But a key statement within that document is this one, worded here. They state that considerable progress has been made in improving child survival. However, in order to help children reach their full development potential, to avoid later chronic disease, and to move towards sustainable development and social equity, the child survival and child development agendas need to be intertwined. So in other words, they were stating quite clearly it's no good to concentrate interventions and efforts on simply making sure children are born and survive. we need to go way beyond that. It's no good being born if then you are born into an environment of poverty and your ability to develop is then compromised. So by combining the agendas of survival and early child development, as we see on the next slide, we're able to double effort. So on the next slide, the actions are now apparent in areas of survival and early child development. So one example from actions on childhood survival can be seen in some of the work by Save the Children, where there's been a concerted effort in training midwives, nurses, doctors, and indeed other lay carers in practices such as mother kangaroo care. This is a practice where the baby is kept close to the mother, providing skin-to-skin contact, in some instances for 24-hour periods, during the very early phases of the infant's life, particularly if the infant is a low birth weight baby. And from that practice, there are many examples of where babies have been able to feed better and therefore grow better and survive. But as I said before, there's no it's not good enough just to help babies survive if we then can't help them develop and grow. So early child development programs is a parallel program that, as the WHO explains, needs to be combined with survival actions. Now, Chan, who was the then director of the WHO, noted that health services have a unique responsibility and indeed opportunity to help families because of the potential through health services to reach all families, and I emphasize here all. So as a result of that, UNICEF and WHO have been developing resources and networks, particularly focusing on the promotion of universal early child development support using home visiting as a key mechanism. Now, this work is particularly exciting because the focus on home visiting, as we'll see on the next slide, I've talked so far about the role of the health visitor from a UK perspective, but as you can see from this list, there are a variety of home visiting nursing roles throughout the world, and they have many various titles. Very few called health visitors, but indeed there are health visitors in Denmark and Norway as well as the UK. But there are other similar roles, but slightly different titles in other countries. So we have child health nurses in Sweden, public health nurses in America, Canada and Ireland, child and family health nurses in Australia, plunket nurses in New Zealand, social nurses in Belgium, and lady health visitors and lady health workers in Pakistan, and patronage nurses in some of the Eastern European countries such as Serbia and Kosovo. Now, what all these practitioners have in common is critically a focus on child health. However, not all of them engage in home visiting, although typically home visiting is a key feature across many of them. On the next slide, I'm going to refer back again to this health visiting work, research work completed at King's College and the review of the literature. What we identified here was something really that helps us start to understand the essence of practice. And I mentioned this because this is, although this was identified through UK evidence, when sharing this with international partners, they increasingly recognise these features as part of their nurse home visitor roles as well. So within this body of evidence, we identified that there was this key orientation, and that orientation was to deliver a service that was concerned with creating good health. In theoretical terms, this is often referred to as being salutogenic, health creating. Importantly, though, the endeavour of creating good health was offered to all people. So this intention of offering a universal service is also important, And that is because human life is valued regardless of who you are. So the idea of demonstrating positive regard for others is also critical. And because it's about a service which is taken to people, it's also about recognizing the different situations that people are in at different times in their lives. And this very much builds on the theme of human ecology. But to deliver the service, as I mentioned previously, it's about working through relationships, by visiting people in their own home and taking the service to families. And it's also about engaging in continual needs assessment so that practice is refined and made specific according to the person that you're working with. So on the next slide, we talk about the context of public health within which practice is delivered. So there is this focus on early life, but it's about delivering the service continually with an awareness of those factors that can determine health. And I've illustrated here, of course, those factors that are associated with the diet that people eat, the environment within which they live, that is their housing, the streets and communities, and also opportunities for exercise and leisure. And when working with families, they must do so by continually keeping the child in mind, remembering that the child is being cared for by a parent or parents who are connected to a wider family who will exert influence and who are living as part of a neighbourhood which will provide or limit resource. And of course that is impacted on by the larger political and social community. And these are ideas which are very much informed by Bronfenbrenner's model of human ecology, often illustrated and explained as a set of Russian nested dolls, hence the illustration here in the corner. So on the next slide, I return to this point about the work that's happening internationally and the great interest that is being taken in UK health visiting, which reminds us that actually the reason we need to honour and ensure we're delivering the very best service we can is not just for our own communities here in the UK, but actually because other countries are looking at UK practice and using our practice as a good model. And therefore, it needs to be the very best it can be if others are seeking to learn from it. So UNICEF are working in Eastern Europe in particular, and working with a number of countries to develop a regional framework for practice. But to do that, there's a need to grow some standards for professional practice and design educational resources, one of which is illustrated here and which I've been fortunate to be part of, which is the role of the home visitor. As part of that work as well, it's about connecting people with one another so that there can be that ongoing learning and sharing of resource. So therefore, they're very much involved in facilitating networks, but also campaigning and working politically to help create a roadmap to help families move along in a particular direction that will support the growth of universal maternal child health and early child development services, but also support the growth of nurse education and professional regulation so that they can, each country, arrive at some level of comprehensive system to support children and families. So, as I mentioned before, England has been seen as a good practice model. On the next slide, I illustrate what that means. So England is being understood as a country which has at the moment a dedicated workforce which is specifically educated and skilled in family home visiting and community practice. It draws and designs its service on a base of evidence which is focused on the healthy delivery of the Healthy Child Programme published by the Department of Health, that has a supporting evidence base which has most recently been updated in a rapid review authored by Axford and colleagues and available on Public Health England websites. But also within England, as a result of the implementation plan, there has been a very clear plan for service investment and development that completed in 2015. And as part of that plan, there was a detailing of levels of service that were based on principles of proportionate universalism, which in essence means ensuring that all families get some level of service, but in times of different need and as needs change, that service can be escalated up and back down again, so that it becomes very relevant and specific to each family. Now you'll see here that I've listed that service offer against what is now recognised as part of the National Service Specification. So working at the community level, a universal level, a universal plus level, and a universal partnership plus level. Alongside that, you'll see in different colours the idea that at the community level that the practitioner is working at building capital, building resource within the community. And these are the different levels that UNICEF are using as part of building their own framework for practice, which is illustrated on the next slide. So you will see here on the next slide this pyramid of universal service which moves up into enhanced or intensive service, and the range of role functions that the health visitor / home visitor will have in meeting the needs of children and families. Here, like in the UK, there is an emphasis on universalism. There's a focus on supporting early child development, and it is understood that engaging parents in this is an imperative part of service delivery. There needs to be a concerted effort in the delivery of the service of working with families as opposed to working on or delivering services to families. And home visiting needs to be understood as a purposeful endeavour that involves skilled, knowledgeable practitioners who are able to deliver a service that provides continuity in the lives of families and that can support a comprehensive service plan for each family. Now, if I return now to the Start and Stay study, which was looking at the workforce needs and the learning that we gained from looking at practice within England, I refer now to a publication that came out just last year from this work, and share here some of the words of some students and practicing health visitors about what their role means to them. Essentially, they talk about this being a worthwhile role and something that was a privilege to do. So the student talked about the fact that by having the chance to visit people in their own homes and get to know families in a particular way through a strong professional relationship, she was able to witness how it highlighted people's strengths even in the face of adversity. She was impressed at how people were able to, through a sense of resilience really, cope with different things that life threw at them and managed to still do the best with the lot that they have. This was very inspiring and gave her this sense of privilege as to get this insight into families' lives. For the qualified health visitor, she talked very clearly about the fact that no two families are alike. She also talked about the fact that each new contact, particularly the birth of a new baby or of a new family moving into the area, presented an exciting challenge. She said the first time you knock on the door, you're starting a new and exciting journey. So we've got here the doorway with a path that's leading forward. There's dark and there's light, so there's a bit of unknown, but actually there's most definitely opportunity by knocking on that door and offering your resource as a service. So I'm moving towards the end now and summing up. So on the next slide, let's consider what is it that health visitors need to keep doing if we're going to move forward. Because although we've had this workforce expansion and although we've had a service transformation, the work is not done. We're now moved into an era where local authorities are commissioning services, and there needs to be a fresh education to ensure that all those partners understand what the contribution of the health visitor can be. So there are things that clearly we still need to keep working at. Families can be the service's best advocates. So connecting and working closely within families is an essential part of moving forward. Not only is it critical because it's essentially what the service is about, but it's actually about respecting the contribution families can make to helping ensure that the service exists. We need to also continue to build on the knowledge and breadth of education that health visitors have. Health visitors don't come as empty vessels. They come as experienced adult nurses, children's nurses, midwives and mental health practitioners. They bring with them to health visiting the knowledge base from those areas of practice, which means they make up a very rich mix of expertise and knowledge that they can make use of within their specialist role. As part of developing as a specialist practitioner, they're learning new research skills. And of course that's necessary because there is a need to continually collect evidence from the practice that they're engaged in order that we can continually learn how to improve practice, but also importantly to demonstrate the impact that practice is having on the lives of children and family. But to keep going and to learn, it's also necessary to network and to share so that we can inform what happens next, both through what practitioners do, but also through what commissioners commission. So it's incumbent upon all of us really to seize the opportunities that we have before us, to be brave and to be bold, and to take that next step. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to discuss those or answer those to the best that I can. And so it just leaves me to say thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed what we've been talking about and thinking about today. And here's my email address if you'd like to make contact. Thank you.